Good evening, everyone. I'm Frank Novak, and this is Point of Reference. Tonight we talk with Congresswoman Niki Tsongas, representing the 3rd Congressional District in Massachusetts, about the latest news from Washington, D.C., and her take on several issues as well. Welcome to the program, Congresswoman Tsongas.
Good to be with you, Frank.
Congresswoman, first question for you, if I could, and that is, given the events of the day in the past weeks and months, President Obama has been referred to at this point in time as a wartime president. That being the case, does that make you a wartime congressperson?
Well, I know when I first sought this seat in 2007, we were still heavily engaged in Iraq with the Iraq War, and I was strongly in favor of a timetable to bring down our effort there and bring our soldiers home. Under President Obama, he did do that. We've continued to be engaged in Afghanistan, and towards the end of this year, again, we will be drawing down our troops to a minimum level and bringing them home, assuming that with the new president of Afghanistan that they sign what's called the Bilateral Security Agreement, which is the agreement between the United States and Afghanistan that will sort of guide our presence and the presence of other NATO allies. And our even staying there modestly is very dependent upon that. And I think, as you say, with the president's commitment to training equipment, moderate Syrian forces, with his decision to send airplanes and conduct airstrikes over Syria, as well as the airstrikes in Iraq, I know that he's certainly confronting a very challenging organization. We all know how lethal ISIS is, what murderous intent it has, but I, for one, could not support that. We had a recent vote on whether or not to arm and equip the moderate Syrian forces, and I could not support that. I firmly believe that we in Congress have to have the opportunity to have a robust debate, not just about that small piece of the strategy, but about all our efforts in Iraq, as Iraq has come yet again to the brink, the appropriateness of what we're contending to do, how successful it's likely to be, will we, how on earth are we going to pay for it? We haven't had that discussion at all. Regional countries have so much at stake. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar want to be very sure that they are as engaged in this as they need to be, because absent their participation, all the military might in the world will not carry the day. So many questions, and I think Congress needs to be engaged. But there's no denying that our president has embarked on a path that poses many questions and is very uncertain in its outcome.
You know, what you're referring to is the fact that that basically having to do with the fact that, as I'm quoting here, Congresswoman Tsongas released the following statement after voting against an amendment that would authorize the Secretary of Defense to train and equip certain Syrian rebel groups in the battle against ISIS. You know, that's what you're referring to, and that being the case, my question also would be the fact that, given the fact that in many cases President Obama is a Democrat, and many times people will think that if you happen to be a Democrat congresswoman and people happen to be in Senate and they're also Democrats, that you'll automatically follow along. But in this case, you part company with regard to what perhaps his well-intention happens to be in order to get more of a discussion. And what do you think additional debate would reveal that you'd be looking for?
Well, you know, you ask a good question in terms of, you know, I think there are some things that our president has accomplished very well. So he was brought into office when we were confronting the greatest challenge to our economy since the Great Depression. And through his policies and through the legislation that we in Congress passed, we were able to stop the free fall and have steadily built back those many jobs that were lost, but there's still much to do. So that is one area in which I strongly supported the president's efforts and think the outcome of those policies has been very positive for all of us, although, as I said, there is much yet to be done. But when it comes to questions of war, that is where we have to really take a hard look, assess the strategy that's being put into place, ask all the hard questions, and that is a debate that needs to take place on the floor of the House of Representatives and on the floor of the United States Senate. It's our bottom line obligation. So as we have engaged gone back into Iraq and engaged primarily through training and looking again at the Iraqi security forces, our strong efforts to lead to a transition in who was leading the country, so that Mr. Maliki has left. I think those are positive and very more modest outcomes. But as we begin to look to Syria and see what's possible there, it's a highly complex situation. We do not have reliable partners there. We do not have a government in place that we can look to partner with. We know how difficult it will be to vet, possibly difficult to vet the moderate Syrian forces to make sure that they're actually our friends and not have no intention of turning upon us when the opportunity presents itself. But these are questions that need to be debated in the whole, not just about what we do in Syria, but what we do as well in Iraq. They're related to one another, as well as what is the role of our international partners, and especially the countries in the region like Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, Turkey, Qatar, because they're Sunni countries that have very much at stake. And if they're not alarmed by what ISIS or ISIL is doing, then we need to take note of that.
You know, you happen to say that given the seriousness of many questions that are being asked by both Republicans and Democrats, you talk about partners who must take direct responsibility. You're talking about of surrounding nations there, and being able to take direct responsibility. Is that a given that you presume will occur, or is that more hopeful than not?
It is not a given, and that's why I think we have to carefully monitor their actions, carefully assess whether or not their participation is real and genuine and will be of a long-standing nature. I think the other question we have to ask ourselves as well is that our president has said all this effort, whatever it is going to obviously spill into future administrations. So we have to be clear as to what that's likely to look like. And again, as I said, the long-term costs of all of this effort need to be laid out for the American people. And I think then Congress has to be asked to vote on what is the logical way forward. And once the president has the support of Congress around a complete strategy and not just this small piece of it, that actually strengthens his hand. The risk is, of course, that he won't get that support. But nevertheless, the debate needs to take place and the vote needs to be taken.
Is there a consensus? You've voiced your opinion on this particular subject, but is there a consensus in Congress that is similar to yours, that to rethink the circumstances here?
Well, I know on the modest vote of training and equipping the moderate Syrian forces, there was basically bipartisan support and there was bipartisan opposition. So I was one of, I think, 82 or 83 Democrats who voted against it, but there were 71 Republicans who voted against it. So I think there are a lot of questions across the board. So on a bipartisan basis, I think we would welcome the opportunity to have a more robust, fuller debate on the floor of the House.
Is it generally conceded that the furthest thing from anybody's mind is wanting to put more boots on the ground specifically in any action there?
Well, I think that's the bottom line for all of us, that and to be certain that that is the case. I think one of the more, I wouldn't want to call it alarming, but I think a statement by General Dempsey. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's the chairman of all the different services. He oversees all of them. And he was asked a question in a Senate Armed Services hearing if he could envision a scenario in which he would recommend that ground troops go into Iraq. And he said he could envision such a scenario. So we want to be, I think, I'm certainly very clear about my belief that we cannot send combat troops into Iraq. But I think, again, the general statement raises the alarm bells. We all feel that as we begin expanding our airstrikes, as we begin the process of training and equipping, that we're on a slippery slope that could inevitably lead to a commitment of ground forces. And so I think that's a part of the debate that needs to take place as well.
How do you reconcile the fact that in that region, when we're talking about in recent months, where say Iraqi forces were utilizing the equipment left by the United States for them to use, basically got up and took a walk, and consequently opposing forces were able to go and regain control of that equipment to our disadvantage, take that into account, then also take into account it may be, let's say, an isolated instance, but also symbolically, didn't play very well when 3 Afghan soldiers or officers were here on Cape Cod being able to receive special training, yet they tried to jump the border in Canada, I don't know, much in the same way that back in the Vietnam era, people that were trying to avoid the draft were trying to cross the border into Canada. Theoretically, symbolically, does that mean anybody seeing this or hearing those stories figures that, will that leave American troops in this country holding the bag in order to take care of security for people when maybe they don't want to make a commitment to do it themselves?
Well, I think the issues with the Iraqi security forces, the original ones, in which when confronted with ISIL, they literally dropped their weapons and left,
They cut and run.
was really more, I think, a testament to the lack of
Training?
well, there's that lack of training. We heavily invested in training when we had our presence in Iraq. But as we've been gone from the country since 2011, much of that training has been let go. But the other thing you hear over and over again is there was not a lot of loyalty or commitment to the Maliki government. The Maliki government, Mr. Maliki was a Shia. That's one aspect of this religion. Many in the services were Sunni, or were not, or insufficiently in presence of Sunni, and when confronted with a Sunni, the ISIL, which is Sunni,
Right.
They simply didn't want to take on the fight, and in part because of a lack of loyalty to Mr. Maliki. So much of our effort in terms of persuading Mr. Maliki to leave, to have a new prime minister who would reach across the lines, reach out to the Kurds, reach out to the Sunnis, reach out and obviously still represent the Shia, has led to a more hopeful belief that the Iraqi security forces, once retrained and brought back up to speed, will be better able to protect their own country and push back on ISIL. The challenge in Syria is that no such group currently exists. And so that's why the effort to work with moderate Syrian army, moderate Syrian rebels, and train them up and hope that they can do as the Iraqi security forces hopefully will be able to do and take on the fight against ISIL. But all of those things raise as many questions and concerns as hopeful as they might be. And as you say, one of the challenges around the Syrian forces and recruiting, and vetting is the whole notion of vetting. And we got a lot of reassurances that they could vet and make sure that the people we were bringing to train were people who would be, as they said they were. But we've seen with the Afghan soldiers who were brought to this country for training purposes, we heard over and over again statements that they had been properly vetted. Now, I'm not saying that as they tried to leave this country, it was that they wished us ill. They might well have been seeking asylum and desiring to stay here, but it just highlights the fact that it's very difficult to completely vet and be very comfortable with your process and know down the road what these soldiers will be, who will be your friend and who will be your enemy in a part of the world where it's constantly changing. The dynamics constantly shift.
The process and the problem is anything but simple, and to say that it's intricately complicated, and I think that's understandable, not favorable, but understandable. But when you say that you'd have to take time in order to go ahead and properly train, let's say, Iraqi forces in order to take their place, the question may be, how long a period of time is long enough for them to do that, and how do you gauge that?
You have to leave that to the military. The military, has been able to assess that, and I think in the early stages of all this turmoil, as ISIS reared its ugly head, the president made a decision to send in a couple of hundred of our American military, whose sole job really was to assess the capabilities of the Iraqi security forces and do it on a unit-by-unit basis. And they were able to identify units that were better prepared and they felt more confident could take on and push back against ISIL, and there were a good number that they felt were fairly hopeless and would require much time and much effort to bring back up to speed. So that's the Iraqi security forces. But in the meantime, the group that the president is seeking to train and equip In Syria, we're starting from scratch. I mean, there's simply, and it will be a very slow process. And our president has said they only envision being able to train about 5,000 of these soldiers by within a year or so. So it's a very long-term process, which means that we won't be seeing those Syrian fighters on the ground anytime soon.
When people take a look, when your constituents or people nationally take a look at what's going on the international theater of what the United States is involved in this particular region, it appears as though, to some people's minds, maybe that there was one step forward as in recent years, but maybe two steps back. And sometimes that may create a crisis in confidence on the part of how people feel about the president, and that goes to how his approval ratings happen to be lower in the past several months. That being the case, is there any sort of a coattail effect that you have to deal with by being a Democrat Congresswoman, and he happens to be a Democratic president? And I'm talking about the coattail effect that can be beneficial when he may be riding high in the polls that may benefit you, but if he's riding lower in the polls, does that also have a negative effect on you, and how do you deal with that?
I find basically that I treat my race for Congress as seriously as I always have. I'm up for re-election this year. I was first elected in 2007 in a special election. And my attitude is that I simply have to earn every vote. And I have to do it on my record, on the things that when I was a candidate that I said I would hope to accomplish, and now that I've been in office a number of years, my accomplishments, and go to the voters and just ask for their consideration. So, I would focus on, among other things, my willingness to work across the aisle in a highly divided Congress. Despite everything, I've been able to reach out and accomplish a good number of things. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. On that committee, I've been able to work with Congressman Mike Turner, who's a Republican from Ohio, who actually came to visit my district in August as I went to visit his district in Dayton, Ohio. But together we have enacted many legislative reforms that have addressed the issue of sexual assault in the military. I think have really...
You're at the forefront of that, and that happened, as I understand it, because of you and your initiatives.
The two of us working together. We each came to it for different reasons. I became familiar with it once elected, and at a hearing on the Armed Services Committee, we had generals from each of the services come to talk about their programs to prevent sexual assault in the military, and I was astonished that it had risen to the level that the services each had to have a program. This was probably November of 2007. Congressman Turner had a constituent whose daughter was sexually assaulted in its most egregious form, was serving with her assailant. She was in the Marine Corps, asked to be transferred out of the unit. That transfer was denied, and she was subsequently murdered by her assailant. So the two of us began at not knowing each other. I was very new to Congress, and this was something that was very recent tragically so, in the life of his district.
Right.
And we began to work on this issue, and looking across the aisle for support, found that we were both focused on it. And as a result of that partnership, over the course of 5 years, year by year by year, we chip away at the many shortcomings. So we've changed the authority of a commander for the first time in decades. A commander can no longer overturn a jury verdict of guilty. Astonishingly, a commander could do that. There is a robust appellate process. Anybody who's found guilty of a major felony can certainly pursue their claims through that appellate process, but a commander can no longer overturn a jury verdict in a sexual assault case or any other significant crime. That's just one example. Now, because of Mr. Turner's experience, if you're assaulted, you can request a transfer out of the unit, so you are no longer serving with your assailant, and if that transfer is denied, there's a right of appeal. It has to be reviewed within 72 hours. We've created a reform that gives survivors access to a lawyer. The lawyer will stand by them and walk them through the judicial process should they seek should they seek to bring charges, and has made a tremendous difference. Over 1,000 survivors have requested this kind of legal assistance, and I think it has the potential to change the way which this crime is dealt more generally. So those are just 3 examples of the kind of changes that we've been able to do. But that's from my willingness to work across the aisle and finding willing partners on issues that I care about. Here in Massachusetts, New Balance is we know a great company that produces great athletic footwear for all of us, and actually they sell them across the world. But they wanted to provide an American-made shoe to new recruits into the military. There is an amendment called the Berry Amendment that says, in general, our soldiers should be wearing American-made products, but an exception had been created for training shoes. So we worked hard, and through our efforts, the Defense Department has changed their policy, which and to now say that those training shoes, like every other piece of clothing that soldiers wear, needs to be American-made where it meets the needs of the particular soldier, which gives New Balance an opportunity for a new market. And the reason it counts is that New Balance every day makes a decision to keep its manufacturing here. And I think companies that do that, given all the pressures to move offshore, should be supported. And given the Berry Amendment does this for every other item of clothing, I thought it was only appropriate that it do it for shoes as well.
With what you happen to mention with the co-sponsorship of the bill that made such drastic changes relative to the sexual assault in the military, and one would have to ask, and it's not a rhetorical question, you can tell me, why would such an amendment be necessary? Is that a large flaw in the military that just allowed that to happen? And did it happen just because it could? And are there any other things that are on the horizon that need to be addressed that you think, that you recognize in being able to go ahead and focus on in that same vein?
Well, it's multifaceted. It's a complex challenge. There's no single bullet to it. If you think about it, it's a series of betrayals that people who make their way into the military seek to serve our country with all the best of intentions, putting their lives on the risk. A series of betrayals that they endure. So if you're a new recruit, and I should make it clear that this is just not a male on female issue. Men are assaulted just as well, male on male assaults take place. But you make your way in, you're so proud to be serving, and then a sexual assault occurs, and that is like the first betrayal. Then you go to your chain of command, who is tasked to deal with these, and the chain of command
Subsequent betrayals.
The chain of command says, oh no, it couldn't have been like that. They don't take it seriously. Then if you do bring your charges forward, often you suffer severe retaliation, both professional as well as personal. So that's the third betrayal. Then if you make your way through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, many biases in that system, not the least of which was that the commander could overturn a jury verdict of guilty. And then often as you make your way out of the VA, into the VA, because what starts in the active duty ends up in the VA, there's often, the VA is often poorly suited to deal with all the after effects of a sexual assault. So it's really, you have to deal with all the different pieces, and in the end it's going to require a culture change, a respect, and a culture that has great respect for all of its members and does not tolerate a climate that allows for these crimes to take place.
Let's talk about and focus on a term you just said with only about 5 minutes left, and that's a culture change. And that is that what has been portrayed in the news media over the past several months and even years is that there's a contentious type of circumstance among Democrats and Republicans in Congress. And you just gave an example of how that is not so, where you happen to be working in cooperation. Is it as contentious as people have been led to believe, or are there lights at the end of the tunnel where things are just not so obstructionist, but that you can in fact get some things done that are as vitally important as the legislation you just talked about in your co-sponsorship with a Republican?
Well, I think if you look at the recent vote on the one we've spent so much time talking about, the training and equipping of the Syrian rebels, that where you had almost as many Republicans as Democrats voting against it, and proportionally almost as many Democrats as Republicans voting for it. So if that's an issue where you see people willing to shed their party labels and simply look at an issue, evaluate it on the merits, and come to their own conclusion and cast a vote that they think is most appropriate. We saw it in a number of instances when there was a necessity to get something done, where we could come together and have votes that in many instances had just as many Republicans as Democrats, if sometimes not more Democrats than Republicans, so that this legislation, when government was shut down a year ago, for example, inevitably Speaker Boehner brought legislation to the floor when it was finally recognized the tremendous harm it was doing to this country to shut down the government. He brought legislation to the floor that allowed for funding of government, to keep it going, to keep it open. Again, that took Democratic and Republican votes in order to pass, to make its way through the Senate and be signed by our president. But it doesn't occur as frequently as it should. And I think in this election year, there are too many things that have been postponed that we should be dealing with in the best interest of this country, rather than having yet a 53rd vote on whether or not to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
In the short time we have left, I'd like to try to approach this different subject, and that happens to be one on immigration. And many people are very concerned about this. In recent months, there have been an influx of many unaccompanied children across the border, across the Texas border, and they have been, according to some statistics, and I'm not sure if these are verifiable, apparently ICE, which is the group that happens to monitor this situation along the border, said that 80% of illegal aliens that are coming across the border are resettled, with 20% being sent back. Now, in many cases, these children, in the case of Lynn, and this, if you can verify or dispute this, is okay, the mayor of Lynn has said that over the, let's say, the past few years, there's been an increase in their school system of 500 Guatemalans that, quite frankly, maybe don't have the proper inoculations, don't have an understanding of the language, and do not even understand their own language, or are illiterate to that degree, and there's no verification of how old they are. Now, that's had a colossally negative impact on their economy by being able to necessitate the education of this group. And when the mayor of the city of Haverhill was sitting in that very seat, and I had asked, I said, how do you deal with something of that type? Because we are also a municipality in Massachusetts, and he says you can't do anything about it. Now, to the normal citizen or constituent watching this, they would say, that has to be unacceptable. And what can you tell us to give us some sort of a sense of confidence or a good feeling that such a circumstance may not be something that this area would be confronted with? Well, and how to reconcile what has happened in Lynn, too.
Well, what I think it really points up to is a need for comprehensive immigration reform. The United States Senate passed on a bipartisan basis a piece of legislation that put in place it dealt with many of these issues in a comprehensive way. So, and in doing that, allows us to address the issue in a more complete way. And we, unfortunately, in the House of Representatives have not had the opportunity to vote on that legislation. The Speaker of the House has flatly refused to bring it to the floor. So first and foremost, we simply have to address comprehensive immigration reform. And I think that will go a long way towards addressing some of these problems. But the issue of undocumented, unaccompanied minors is a slightly different issue. So that is an issue that is occurring as a result of horrific conditions in the Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Children who are confronting unbelievable conditions and are fleeing, so often with their parents' encouragement, are fleeing their own communities and not crossing the border illegally, but throwing themselves at the mercy of our Border Patrol because they're hoping for help. There was a law that was passed several years ago when President Bush was in office that was designed to address the issue of trafficking in minors, because there was great fear that a lot of minors in these countries, young children, were being trafficked, and put in place a legal process to determine whether or not they were in fact being at risk of being trafficked, or something else was driving them to our border and making distinction and where appropriate, sending them back. But as those conditions have just deteriorated in these countries of Central America, the numbers of kids who are fleeing has grown to the point where the legal system that is in place has not been able to handle it in a timely way. And so what's happened is there are nonprofits and other organizations who have applied to help take care of these children in the interim while the legal process works its way and a decision is made as to whether or not it's appropriate for them to stay because they're either being trafficked or because they have family members here who can be responsible for them. I don't know about the situation in Lynn. It's not in my district. As I was saying, I'm not familiar with the details of it. I know we've had some issues in the other communities of the district, and we as an office are trying to get a handle on what those real numbers are so that we can look to see if there are federal resources that might be able to be a help.
Congresswoman Niki Tsongas, thank you very much for joining us. That'll have to be the last word, but we appreciate you being here this evening. We'd like to invite you back for a subsequent sit-down.
Thank you, Frank. It's always good to be here.
Thank you. We hope that this program has been a point of reference for you, and until next time, my name is Frank Novak. Thanks very much for watching.